Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents Ring of Fire, High-Stakes Mining in a Lowlands Wilderness by Virginia Heffernan. Narrated by Nikki Zakocs. The Ring of Fire is a 5,000 square kilometer crescent of ancient volcanic rock rich in nickel, copper, and other metals considered critical to the global transition to renewable energy. The metal deposits lie hidden beneath the remote swamps of the Hudson Bay and James Bay Lowlands of northern Canada, the second largest temperate wetland in the world. The area is home to several thousand Indigenous people in communities accessible only by plane or winter road. The deposits, too, are stranded by a lack of infrastructure. In 2022, Canada and the province of Ontario pledged billions of dollars towards a critical minerals strategy, including building an all-weather road to the Ring of Fire. Introduction. Tremors of Disruption. Scott Jacob scans the sea of suits. He points to the only chairs remaining in the makeshift food court assembled to feed and water thousands. We scurry over to them, heads down, weaving through the crowd. About 23,000 people, more than enough to fill a National Hockey League arena, are gathered deep in the bowels of the Metro Toronto Convention Centre on this day in early March 2020. They've flown in from more than 100 countries and remote Canadian communities to participate in the world's largest mining event, the Prospectors and Developers Association of Canada, or PDAC, convention. The 4-day whirlwind of deal-making and partying held annually is timed to coincide with spring thaw, when prospectors traditionally emerged from the Canadian bush for a few weeks of leisure before heading back to their claim holdings. But the 90-year-old event's renown as a hotspot for fundraising for mineral exploration and mine development has long since spread beyond Canada's borders. This year, the Chinese delegation and its supersized marquee are noticeably absent. Hand sanitizer dispensers have replaced the usual swag at the exhibitor booths. But you would never know from all the handshaking and bear-hugging going on that the world is in the grips of the highly contagious COVID-19 virus. We'd soon find out what that carelessness cost. The business of reunion going on around us sounds like a massive cocktail party. Indeed, until relatively recently in the convention's history, the men would have been enjoying free beers with their lunch, not $4 bottles of water. The rare woman walking the floor would more likely identify as a convention booth bunny than a geoscientist or a financier. When I first started to attend the event as a member of the press in the 1990s, I was advised to leave my heels at home unless I wanted to be propositioned. Any Indigenous person brave enough to attend might well have been shown the door. Passions run high when fortunes reach the level of risk that mineral exploration investments inherently involve. In those days, disagreements would occasionally evolve into brawls amid the all-day drinkers at the convention. Once, around the dinner hour, two old friends and business associates from northeastern Ontario had a falling out. On March 9, 1987, Timmins Timmy Bissonnette gunned down stock promoter Guy LaMarche with a silver-plated revolver on the escalator of the Royal York, the grand old hotel that had been hosting the convention since 1944. LaMarche died on the scene. Bissonnette was sentenced to life in prison. The convention's Wild West nature has since been replaced with a much more corporate vibe. Female representation in the sector has increased incrementally to 16% in Canada. But the biggest change, with the introduction and growth of Indigenous programming this century, is the acknowledgement by industry and government that Indigenous peoples have a significant role to play as partners in exploration and mining. With a few sweeps of his forearm, Jacob, former chief of the Wet'suwet'en First Nation, an Ojibway community in far northern Ontario, wipes the crumbs off the corner of the long table jammed with men wolfing down triangular sandwiches from clear plastic containers. He gestures for me to take a seat beside him on a stackable chair, still radiating heat from its last occupant. We have to shout to make ourselves heard over the din. Jacob is describing what it was like for him, as chief of the nearest community to the Ring of Fire, to be hit by a sudden surge of helicopters and prospectors descending on Wet'suwet'en in the James Bay Lowlands in the summer of 2007, when the first nickel discovery was made. Prospectors ply their trade not only for the adventure of exploration and discovery, but for the slim chance a public company may come along one day, option their claims, and turn them into mines that pay royalties. At the time, Jacob wasn't sure whether to be pleased or angry about the rush. But our elders told us, just be prepared for what is to come. Jacob says the Wet'suwet'en elders recalled what had happened to another Ojibway First Nation, Mishki-Agamong, to this day the most northerly Indigenous community in the province to have all-weather road access. When Ontario decided to build the road, Highway 599, north from Thunder Bay to service gold deposits in the area in the 1950s, the province relocated the Mishki-Agamong Reserve closer to the highway. Community members had no say in either the road building or the relocation. Coinciding with the new system of social assistance from Ottawa, the move drastically changed their way of life, and most had to abandon hunting, fishing, and trapping. The people were not used to living together year-round in a large group, and there was too little full-time employment, according to Mishki-Agamong's website. Traditional structures had broken down, and new organizations had not yet taken their place effectively. A similar tragedy continues to play out decades later in many of the Indigenous communities under Treaty 9, also known as the James Bay Treaty, covering present-day Ontario north of the land separating the Great Lakes watershed from the Hudson and James Bay drainage basins. Signed in 1905 to 1906, after Confederation, the purpose of the treaty was to buy land and resources from Cree and Ojibway peoples to allow for white settlement and resource development. In exchange, the Indigenous residents were to receive cash payments, reserves to live on, education for their children, and hunting, fishing, and trapping rights. But the treaty turned out to be a lopsided deal, deeply favoring the settlers. As part of the settlement effort, Ontario passed the Mines Act of 1906, allowing prospectors to move freely through the wilderness, armed with picks and shovels. Even today, anyone over the age of 18 can obtain a prospector's license, granting entry to Crown land. About 87% of Ontario's landmass is considered by the federal and provincial governments to belong to the Crown. Until recently, if a prospector found valuable minerals, or even had a hunch they might exist, they could simply cut 4 lines through the bush, hammer in wooden claim posts at the 4 corners of the square, register the claim with the province, and take ownership of whatever valuable minerals lay within. They had an obligation to work the claim so it wouldn't lie fallow, mapping, rock sampling, and so forth, but otherwise were free to prospect. In 2012, the province revised what is now called the Ontario Mining Act to require Indigenous consultation before exploration takes place. And in 2018, the province moved to an online map staking system, but the spirit of the law remains the same. Treaty 9 overlaps with what is known as Ontario's Far North, an area twice the size of the United Kingdom, stretching from the Manitoba border in the west to James Bay in the east. The far north contains the world's second largest temperate wetland and largest boreal forest untouched by development. It is home to roughly 24,000 people, 90% First Nations, in 31 communities. The Cree call it the breathing lands, the lungs of Canada. The area is so remote that some of its rivers remain unmapped. The Ring of Fire, where the metal endowment includes not just nickel, copper, and platinum group metals, but chromium, gold, and zinc, lies at the heart of this unique and special region. Naturally, the Ojibway, Cree, and Ojibway, a blend that occurred as Ojibway moved north into Cree territory during the fur trade. Communities near and downstream of the Ring of Fire insist on playing a significant role in the decision-making around any proposed mining development as a way to minimize environmental damage and share in the resulting wealth. The Constitution Act of 1982 enshrined Indigenous rights to be consulted by the Crown on activities that could adversely affect them, including mineral exploration and mining. Supreme Court rulings over the past 2 decades have affirmed this right. Though consultation does not imply a veto on development, free, prior, and informed consent, the wording of the nation's Declaration of the Rights of Indigenous Peoples adopted by Canada in 2021, perhaps does. We're at a watershed moment in Canadian and global history, when Indigenous peoples are taking some control over resource development on their traditional lands. As an exploration geoscientist turned mining journalist, I was naturally drawn to the fevered excitement of the 2007 Ring of Fire mineral discovery and its potential to become a major international source of several important metals. But my initial perspective was too narrow. As years passed and Indigenous communities across Canada exercised their constitutional right to be consulted on resource development, the fate of the remote region became increasingly uncertain, and the implications of the ongoing discoveries more intriguing. The mineral-rich area encapsulates all the challenges of resource development in Canada: the potential for environmental damage, a lack of infrastructure that leaves resources stranded, and a regulatory and Indigenous consultation process that can be opaque. Although the mining sector accounts for roughly 5% of the nation's GDP and employs about 700,000 people directly and indirectly, with mining workers earning an average annual salary of $123,000 Canadian in 2019, these challenges threaten further investment. By 2012, the Ring of Fire was shaping up to be an epic 3-way battle among a mining industry unaccustomed to having its ownership of mineral discoveries questioned, a provincial government that considered Indigenous relations to be a federal matter, and members of First Nation communities who took their right to consultation seriously, along with their duty to protect the land for future generations. More than a decade later, recognition that the region's nickel, copper, and other metals could play a significant role in the world's transition to renewable energy added an extra layer of complexity. Did the contentious Ring of Fire stand a chance of ever being developed? If not, the opportunity cost would be high. By virtue of its size, relative infancy in the exploration mining sequence, and critical mineral endowment, the Ring of Fire represents an unprecedented chance to build a global model of resource management in which benefits to country and community far outweigh social and environmental costs. To allow the Ring of Fire to smolder amid ongoing conflict would be irresponsible to all stakeholders. Indigenous partnership will be the catalyst for development. The mineral exploration and mining sector is already the largest private sector employer of Indigenous people and an important client for Indigenous-owned businesses in Canada. The Ring of Fire itself is one of the most significant metal discoveries of the 21st century and has the potential to become a long-lasting mining camp. Electric vehicle manufacturers and other green revolution capitalists are eager to get their hands on the area's critical metals and minerals. But a measured, collaborative approach to mining development in this fragile area that is more in line with Indigenous sensibilities is the only way to avoid perpetuating the inequities of the past. By our meeting at PDAC 2020, Jacob had become the manager of community relations for Norront Resources, the main industry player in the Ring of Fire. He tells me he would move back to his fly-in community of Wetland from his current home in Thunder Bay if there were any housing available. He still has older family members there, and some of them are fragile. Most suffered from abuse at the residential school they were forced to attend. They struggle with their mental and/or physical health as a result. One uncle simply disappeared, never to return from boarding. As we chat about personal tragedy amid the money-making melee, a who's who of Indigenous leaders either stops to talk or waves from a distance. There's David Paul Ashni-Penescum, CEO of Matawa Tribal Council, which represents 9 First Nations and 10,000 people in the region near the Ring of Fire. And here comes his cousin, Bruce Ashni-Penescum, chief of one of those nations, Martin Falls, which lies about 100 kilometers southeast of the mineral deposits. Taking a seat across from us and sporting a leather cowboy hat is Jerry Asp, former chief of the powerful Tahltan Nation in BC, founder of the largest Indigenous-owned heavy construction company in Western Canada, and member of the Mining Hall of Fame. He devours a styrofoam bowl of noodle soup as he reminisces about flying plane loads of Kentucky Fried Chicken into Wetland when he was advising the band council there on how to proceed with the Ring of Fire. Jacob erupts in laughter at the memory. Next, fellow Hall of Famer Mackenzie Mac Watson sidles over to greet us. Watson is a geologist whose junior company, Free West Resources, discovered the chromite that put the Ring of Fire on the world stage. He gives Jacob a ribbing about the dormant status of the development a decade after he sold Free West to an American mining company for $240 million Canadian in cash. "Get that road up there so you can get some work for the kids," he exclaims over his shoulder as he drifts back into the crowd to the tune of Jacob's ringtone. You guessed it, Johnny Cash's Ring of Fire. Watson must be reading Jacob's mind because as we speak, Ontario Premier Doug Ford and Greg Rickford, his Minister of Energy, Northern Development and Mines, and Minister of Indigenous Affairs, are making their way to the Ontario Pavilion. They are about to announce an agreement with the current chief of Wetland, Cornelius Wabas, and Martin Falls Ashni-Penescum to do just that. Dubbed the Northern Road Link, the new road would connect Martin Falls and Wetland to each other and to the provincial highway system for the first time. Jacob is pumped about the announcement, saying it represents the most progress made for Indigenous communities in Northern Ontario in years. But the road has yet to be embraced by some of the other 7 nations in the Matawa Tribal Council. Some are downright opposed to it. Following the press conference, the media spotlight swivels to Chief Chris Munius of Neshkantaga First Nation, a tiny community 130 kilometers upriver of the proposed mining camp. He is concerned about how the road and other developments will affect the Ottawa-Piscot River watershed that begins at his community and runs through the Ring of Fire on its way to James Bay. You can expect opposition if Ontario, or any road proponent, tries to put a shovel in the ground of our territory without our consent, he tells CKDR News. Later in the day, the cracks in the tribal council become even more apparent when only 5 of the 9 chiefs attend a panel discussion on development of Ontario's far north. Those who do participate say their priorities lie with housing and clean drinking water before development. There is opportunity in the air, but I think before we talk about billion-dollar projects in our region, we would like to have some of our infrastructure dealt with. Chief Harvey Yesno of Apnatung First Nation tells the audience, "We've had 115 years of illegal seizure and occupation by Ontario. I think you can see the inequity in that land swindle." It's the same message put forward in 2006 when the PDAC Convention introduced Indigenous programming to foster more collaboration, namely to put First Nations, Inuit, and Métis on a level playing field with the rest of Canada's citizens, so they have, at the very least, the capacity to deal with resource negotiations. The country and the province have spent tens of millions towards this goal in the James Bay Lowlands, but have achieved next to nothing. Neshkantaga is entering its 26th year of a boil water advisory. A bag of milk costs $15 Canadian. Gas is $2.20 per liter Canadian. Dwellings house up to 18 people. Outside the convention, a couple of hundred protesters have gathered on Toronto's Front Street, yelling, "Shame!" Some are in solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs who are opposing the Coastal GasLink project in BC. Others are protesting environmental and human rights abuses by Canadian miners overseas. The protesters would like to stop or curtail most resource extraction. Today feels like a pivotal moment for Canadians and our resource-dependent economy. What will it take to move forward towards a common goal? Part 1. Prospectors and Promoters. Chapter 1. Volcanoes, Glaciers, and Ancient Seas. In the unlikely event that you found yourself traipsing through the remote swamp harboring the Ring of Fire, you'd never imagine that beneath your waterlogged boots was a trove of metal deposits to rival some of the richest in the world. Even if you were a trained geologist, there would be scant evidence to point to a potential mining camp because the rocks hosting the metals lie hidden beneath a thick cap of muskeg, an acidic peat anchoring scattered patches of moss and stunted trees, as well as sand, gravel, and below that, limestone. This cover-up is the handiwork of the last ice age, which began a little over 2.5 million years ago and ended 10,000 years back. During this period, ice sheets up to 3 kilometers thick blanketed almost all of Canada and most of the northern U.S., Europe, and Asia. The sheet centered on Hudson Bay and covering modern-day Ontario and Quebec was called Laurentide. Laurentide was dynamic, expanding and contracting like a beating heart in response to brief warming and cooling periods. All that forceful movement over hundreds of thousands of years scraped and pulverized the rock below, redepositing it as sand and gravel, known as glacial till. At the same time, the weight of the ice pressed the land down like a human would a mattress. But by about 8,000 years ago, the climate was warming quickly and irrevocably. Laurentide was on its last legs, already split in two and dripping water relentlessly from its edges and underbelly. The waters in the Hudson and James Bay expanded in response. They overflowed their western banks, rushing into the bowl of depressed land to form a water body later named the Tyrrell Sea, after the renowned Canadian geologist Joseph Tyrrell, who led several expeditions into Canada's north. The sea spread westward 100 to 250 kilometers. It is estimated to have been about 280 meters deep, nearly as deep as the Eiffel Tower is tall. Then, not nearly as dramatically, the sea contracted as the last of the heavy ice sheet disappeared. Released from its burden, the land was free to rebound. Still sodden, underlain by permafrost, and poorly drained, the area that had been submerged for so long was now rising and ripe for the formation of muskeg. The top and most recent layer blanketing the ring of fire deposits of chromium, copper, gold, nickel, zinc, and other metals. The slow but dynamic rebound continues to this day, adding approximately 2 kilometers of shoreline per century. Beneath this spongy swamp that makes infrastructure logistics challenging lies a thick layer, up to 300 meters in some areas, of limestone formed long before the last ice age on the floors of seas warm enough to swim in as they washed over the area repeatedly 350 to 450 million years ago. The beds of sedimentary rock accumulated as calcium carbonate, crystallized in the warm water, and carcasses of sea urchins and coral decomposed. Today, the gravel bars lining the rivers of the James Bay watershed are littered with evidence of these ancient sea creatures preserved in limestone pebbles, a budding paleontologist's paradise. You'd have to dig a little deeper to find the rocks hosting the Ring of Fire mineral deposits. They are among the oldest and most stable in the world, dating back to when Earth was still a turbulent teenager nearly 3 billion years ago. The cracks that formed within them as the planet later groaned and shifted are the ideal conduits for hot magma rising up from Earth's mantle. But these so-called basement rocks rarely poke their heads above the thick cover of sand, gravel, and limestone in the James Bay Lowlands. In the swamp, there's only one way to see this ancient metal-rich geology and its peculiarities without embarking on the expensive business of drilling, by employing geophysics to see through the cover layers. As far back as the 1960s, the Geological Survey of Canada was flying airborne surveys over the lowlands to detect magnetic variations in the rocks and constructing maps to interpret the hidden geology. But it wasn't until De Beers, the global diamond monopoly, found diamonds in the lowlands in the 1980s that geoscientists began to view these preliminary maps, and the ones that would follow, with an eye to mineral wealth. Some in the academic world were indignant when the late Richard Nemes, the promoter responsible for kickstarting the mineral rush to the area, named his discovery the Ring of Fire, after a song by Johnny Cash, his favorite performer. The Ring of Fire is formal nomenclature for a seismically active belt that encircles the Pacific Ocean. It seemed grandiose to give this swampy morass in northern Ontario the same name as such a globally significant geological feature. But Nemes was onto something bigger than fan love. Geologists now speculate that the only way Nemes's ring could contain so much mantle-derived, or ultramafic, magma and metal was if some cataclysmic geological event, such as 2 continents colliding or separating, had cracked open the basement rocks. Imagine a ship washing up on a shoal, floorboards splintering. When the ship returns to sea, the water rushes in. The same physics are at play when continents collide, one sliding over the other and shattering the surrounding rock with the force of the collision. When the landmass retreats, rifts open up, allowing magma to flow rapidly to surface. The modern-day analogues are violent rumblings and eruptions along the official Ring of Fire, in places such as Washington State, Japan, and the Philippines. Now, cast your mind back 2.7 billion years. The crust is splitting apart just...
Sample complete. Ready to continue?